Highways stretch endlessly into the night, offering a sense of freedom and escape. But when darkness falls and the roads empty, they become lonely corridors where unseen forces wait, ready to strike. Every flicker of light, every shadow cast by the moon hides something unknown. Tonight, we bring you 3 true stories of highways that are much more than just strips of asphalt. They're gateways to fear. Keep your eyes open, because once you drive on these roads, there is no turning back. Struggle for the journey of your life. Evan Z. had always considered himself a helpful person. In fact, if you'd asked anyone who knew him, they'd describe him as the type of guy who'd go out of his way to assist others, even if it meant putting himself at a slight inconvenience. But after what happened that night on Highway 16, Evan would never stop for a stranger again. It was a late Friday night, nearing midnight, and Evan was driving home after another grueling shift at the factory. The long hours and overtime were beginning to take their toll, and all he could think about was his bed. His body ached with exhaustion, and his eyelids felt heavy as he navigated the familiar stretch of Highway 16. The road was empty, save for his headlights piercing the darkness, and the occasional reflective signpost flashing by in the periphery of his vision. The clock on the dashboard blinked. 11:43 p.m. Still a few more miles until home. Just then, he saw it. A car parked on the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights flickering weakly in the night. It was an old Ford Taurus, a model from the 90s, its once vibrant paint now dull and peeling. Evan instinctively slowed down. His initial thought was to keep driving. After all, it was late, and stopping for a stranger on an empty highway wasn't exactly the safest decision. But his conscience tugged at him. What if it were him stranded on the side of the road with no one around to help? With a sigh, Evan pulled over to the side of the road and turned on his blinkers. The car in front of him was eerily quiet, its engine dead, its hazard lights pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat. As Evan stepped out of his car, the cool night air hit him, bringing with it a strange sense of foreboding. Something about the silence of the road felt wrong. But he pushed the thought aside. A figure appeared from the shadows, waving desperately. It was a man, probably in his mid-40s, dressed in a wrinkled, disheveled suit. His hair was disheveled, and there was an almost frantic look in his eyes. As Evan approached, the man's face lit up with relief. "Thank God," the man said, his voice shaky. "I've been out here for hours. My tire blew out, and wouldn't you know it, my spare's flat too." Evan nodded sympathetically, glancing at the car's flat front tire. "That's some bad luck," he said. "I've got a spare in my trunk. It might fit your car." The man's expression softened into what looked like genuine gratitude. "You're a lifesaver. Really." Without a second thought, Evan turned toward his trunk to grab the spare tire, but as he walked, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. The night was unnaturally still, too still. No wind, no sounds of wildlife, not even the distant hum of passing cars. It was as if the world had been muted, leaving only the faint, irregular flicker of the car's hazard lights to break the oppressive silence. He opened his trunk and began rummaging for the spare, but the unease only grew stronger. Something wasn't right. His instincts were screaming at him to leave, but he didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. After all, it was just a guy who needed help, right? As he lifted the spare tire out of the trunk, he turned to glance back at the man. That's when he noticed it. Dark stains on the man's suit, just barely visible in the dim light of Evan's flashlight. At first, He thought it was just oil or dirt, but the longer he looked, the more it resembled something darker, thicker. Evan's heartbeat quickened. He tried to ignore the rising tide of anxiety, but the feeling of dread was becoming impossible to shake. Something about the man's posture, the way he stood so still, so unnervingly calm, set off every alarm in Evan's head. He quickly walked back to the car, trying to keep his voice steady. "You okay?" Evan asked, forcing a smile. Yeah, the man replied quickly. "Just been a long night, you know." Evan nodded, though the knot in his stomach only tightened. As he knelt down beside the car to position the jack, his flashlight caught something in the grass, something metallic. He leaned closer, his heart thudding in his chest. There, half buried in the dirt, was a large nail, a construction nail, sharpened to a deadly point. The head of the nail was painted red. His blood ran cold. He'd heard about this, rumors passed around by truckers and frequent highway travelers. Stories about gangs or sadistic individuals who'd place sharpened nails on the road, waiting for some unlucky driver to get a flat tire. Then, when they pulled over, Evan's breath hitched in his throat. He stood up slowly, his eyes flicking between the nail, the car, and the man. His instincts were screaming at him to get out, to leave now, but he couldn't just run without saying something. I just remembered. I've got somewhere to be. I'm really sorry, but I can't help after all." The man's expression darkened instantly. The friendly smile he'd worn just moments ago faded, replaced by something colder, more menacing. His eyes seemed to narrow, and his lips curled into a predatory grin. "Leaving already?" the man asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "But we were just getting started." Evan's pulse raced. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. That's when he saw them, two figures emerging from the shadows of the nearby woods. They were dressed in all black, their faces obscured by dark masks. One of them held something long and sharp, and it gleamed ominously in the moonlight. Evan didn't wait another second. He turned and sprinted toward his car, his footsteps pounding against the asphalt. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the masked figures moving closer, their footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins as he reached for the car door. He yanked it open, throwing himself inside just as one of the masked figures reached his window. Evan fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tires screeching as he sped down the highway. In his rearview mirror, he saw them, the man in the suit and the two masked figures standing in the middle of the road, watching him with cold, predatory eyes. The man raised his hand, waving mockingly, as Evan disappeared into the night. If this story had you holding your breath and feeling your heart race, hit the like button and share it with those who think they can handle the terror. Imagine, if you were in Evan's shoes, would you have stopped so easily? This is only the beginning. Darkness has just entered Evan's life, and this ominous road stretches far ahead. So stay with us because what lies ahead is even more spine-chilling. Evan didn't stop driving until he reached the comforting fluorescent glow of a gas station miles away. His hands were still trembling, his heart racing as he parked under the harsh, unnatural light. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Yet despite the safety of the well-lit lot, he couldn't shake the suffocating fear that clung to him. It felt as though a pair of eyes was still watching him, lurking somewhere just out of sight. For a while, he simply sat in his car, trying to calm his breathing, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face again, his eyes narrowing, that mocking smile, the cruel way he waved goodbye as Evan sped away. The masked figures haunted him too, faceless phantoms with unknown intentions, lurking in the shadows. Evan's skin prickled as he noticed another car entering the gas station. It was an old beat-up pickup truck, and it rolled to a stop just a few spaces away. Evan's mind immediately flashed back to the highway, the memories of that night fresh in his mind. He had to remind himself to breathe as he watched the driver, a burly man in a baseball cap, climb out and walk toward the gas station entrance. Evan exhaled, forcing himself to relax. He was just jumpy, he told himself, but the fear had burrowed deep into his mind. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As he waited, his eyes darted around, expecting to see those same masked figures or that man in the wrinkled suit appear, stalking him even here. The line rang, and finally, a calm voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? Evan's voice came out in a stammer, his words tumbling over one another as he tried to recount what had happened on Highway 16. He told them everything, the broken-down car, the man's strange behavior, the two masked figures emerging from the woods, and how he had barely escaped. He felt foolish, like he was describing a horror movie rather than something that had actually happened to him. "All right, sir," the operator replied, her voice professional but sympathetic. "We'll send a unit to investigate. Can you give me the exact location where this happened?" Evan rattled off the mile marker and intersection, and she assured him that officers would be dispatched. After a few more moments, she thanked him and ended the call. He should have felt a sense of relief, but as he sat there in the empty parking lot, surrounded by silence, he felt just as uneasy as he had on that dark stretch of highway. He watched the old pickup truck driver pay and return to his vehicle, and he realized how ridiculous he must look. Pale, shaken, as if he'd seen a ghost. But he had seen something real. An hour later, he watched as two police cruisers finally pulled into the gas station. The officers approached his car cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the dim lot as they sized him up. He knew he probably looked unhinged, his clothes rumpled, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't care. All he wanted was for them to believe him. They introduced themselves and asked Evan to follow them back to the spot on Highway 16. He felt a chill as he agreed, his mind racing with visions of the dark road, of the masked figures lurking in the shadows. But he followed them, keeping his distance, his heart pounding in his chest, as he wondered what, if anything, they would find. When they finally arrived at the stretch of highway, it was as deserted as ever, the road bathed in the cold glow of their headlights. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, scanning the area with their flashlights. Evan could see their expressions shift as they realized there was nothing there. No broken-down Taurus, no signs of anyone lurking in the woods. The highway stretched on, silent and empty, as if nothing had ever happened. One of the officers, a tall man with a tired expression, approached Evan, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure this is where it happened?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Yes," Evan insisted, his voice trembling. "This is it. I'm sure." The officer glanced at his partner, who shrugged. "We're not seeing anything here, Mr. Z. Maybe it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. Night driving can do that to you, especially when you're exhausted." Evan felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to scream, to shake them until they believed him, but he knew it would do no good. He could see it in their eyes. They thought he was crazy, just another overworked man hallucinating on a lonely stretch of road. He wanted to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He took a shaky breath, glancing around one last time, his eyes scanning the tree line. It was as if they were mocking him, the shadows stretching across the road, whispering that he was alone in his fear. The officers gave him a sympathetic nod, then returned to their cars, leaving Evan standing alone in the darkness. As he climbed back into his own car, Evan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him like a shroud. He knew he wasn't crazy. He had seen them, and they were still out there, somewhere, waiting for their next victim. The thought made his blood run cold, and he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he drove away. For days after, Evan couldn't escape the terror that gripped him. Every shadow seemed menacing, every flicker of movement a threat. The world felt different, darker, as if a veil had been lifted and he was finally seeing it for what it really was. The memory of that night haunted him, creeping into his mind at the worst times, when he was alone, when he was trying to sleep, when he closed his eyes and saw that twisted smile and those dark figures lurking just out of reach. He tried to go back to his normal life, but it was impossible. Every time he got behind the wheel, he felt the same sense of dread, the fear that he was being watched, that someone or something was following him. He avoided Highway 16, taking longer routes just to feel safe, but even that didn't help. The memory followed him wherever he went, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. One night, as he lay in bed, he thought he heard something outside his window. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down his spine. He sat up, his heart pounding, his eyes darting around the room as he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. But the sound persisted, a soft, almost rhythmic scratching, like nails scraping against glass. Evan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to look, didn't want to know what was outside, but his curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he climbed out of bed, his hands trembling as he approached the window. He could feel his heart racing, his mind racing with images of the man in the suit, the masked figures, the gleam of something sharp in the moonlight. He reached out, his hand hovering over the curtain, hesitating for a moment before pulling it back. There was nothing there, just the empty street, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlight. He exhaled, his body sagging with relief, but the fear didn't go away. It clung to him, a constant reminder of what he had seen, of what he couldn't escape. As he climbed back into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, just beyond his line of sight. And he knew, deep down, that no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to forget, they would always be watching, waiting for the moment when he let his guard down. And as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, they would find him again. What would you have done if you were in Evan's place? Would you have stepped out to help? Or would you have driven past, ignoring your inner fears? Drop your thoughts in the comments. These haunting tales remind us that sometimes we need to trust our instincts. And if you've ever had a similar unsettling experience on the road, or a chilling story from your travels, share it with us below. Who knows, you might become a part of someone else's nightmares. Our next story comes from James, a long-haul trucker who spent more nights than he can count driving through the most remote stretches of highway in the country. He was used to the eerie isolation, the endless roads that stretched out into the darkness. But one night, James encountered something that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. It was around 2 a.m., and James was driving through a stretch of highway that cut through a thick forest. The road was completely empty, the only light coming from his headlights and the pale glow of the moon overhead. He'd driven this route dozens of times before, but tonight something felt different. As he rounded a bend in the road, something darted across his path. At first, James thought it was a deer. He'd seen plenty of them on his late-night runs, but as his headlights illuminated the figure, he realized it was something far more disturbing. Standing in the middle of the road was a creature unlike anything James had ever seen. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with long, gangly limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. The creature's snout was elongated, like that of a wolf or a dog, but its proportions were all wrong. Its body was twisted, hunched, as if it were contorted in pain. For a moment, James and the creature stared at each other, both frozen in place. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The creature's yellow eyes locked onto his, unblinking, as if it were sizing him up, deciding whether or not he was a threat. James's mind raced. He didn't believe in the supernatural. He was a practical man. But the thing standing in front of him defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf, and it sure as hell wasn't human. Without warning, the creature moved. Its long limbs carried it across the road with an unnatural grace, its glowing eyes never leaving James. It disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road, but James didn't move. He sat there, his truck idling, his heart still racing as he tried to make sense of what he'd just seen. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The forest around him was deathly silent, as if all the animals and insects had gone into hiding. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, were nowhere to be heard. Finally, James pressed his foot to the gas pedal and slowly began to drive forward. His eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, half expecting the creature to leap out at him from the shadows. But the road remained empty, and after a few miles, James let out a shaky breath. For weeks after, James couldn't stop thinking about that night. He told a few of his trucker buddies about the encounter, but most of them laughed it off, calling it a late-night hallucination or sleep deprivation. But James knew what he had seen, and he knew that whatever it was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next traveler to cross its path. If these stories have left you thinking or glancing around just to make sure you're not alone, then hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Darkness is always filled with secrets that may never see the light of day. By subscribing to Nightmare Narratives, you'll join us on these dark journeys, and each time we release a new story, you'll be the first to know. So, brace yourself, because no one knows what might be lurking in the next night's shadow.